Major Erich Hoenmanns couldn't find the ground. The fog of this January morning in 1940 had turned his Messerschmitt Bf-108 Taifun into a ghost, drifting through endless white. He scanned desperately for any glimpse of the Rhine River to guide him to Cologne. Beside him, his passenger sat rigid in his seat, leather briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. The Taifun's engine suddenly sputtered, then fell silent. Through the fog, dark shapes materialized, jagged treetops piercing white void. With no power and dropping fast, Hoenmanns fought to keep the aircraft level. The controls trembled in his hands as the aircraft descended through the mist. His heart stopped at the impact. Wings tearing through branches, metal screaming against wood. The Taifun slammed into an open field, skidding to a violent stop. By some miracle, both men emerged practically unscathed. Hoenmanns stumbled out and asked a farmer for directions. A chill ran through him. He wasn't in neutral Holland as he had thought. He was in Belgium. Within minutes, the Belgian military surrounded the crash site. Despite the tensions between Belgium and Germany, it should have been a routine inspection, but there was nothing routine about Hoenmanns' passenger, Major Helmut Rheinberger of Fliegerführer 220. As they were placed under arrest, Rheinberger's composure finally shattered. He broke down weeping with the knowledge that Germany's most closely guarded secret now lay in enemy hands. The war could be over before it even began, and somewhere in Berlin, Hitler's fury was already stirring. The two German officers were dragged to a local military post and thrown into custody. The Belgian soldiers, unaware of what they had discovered, carelessly left the confiscated documents on a desk in front of their prisoners. In a frantic whisper, Rheinberger explained, those papers were Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the complete strategic plans for Germany's invasion of France through Belgian territory. If these documents reached Belgian command, Britain and France would be alerted immediately. The invasion would fail before it began, and hundreds of thousands of German lives were at stake. Panic set in. The two men hatched a desperate plan. Hoenmanns would distract the guards, asking to be taken to the washroom. While they were occupied, Rheinberger would grab the documents and burn them on the stove. Hoenmanns did his part, pulling the guards' attention. Rheinberger grabbed the documents and thrust them into the flames. But the stove lid seared his hands, and he dropped them, the clang echoing through the room. The guards turned. They were caught. The guards began to wonder what made these documents so valuable that the Germans would risk everything to destroy them. Suspicious, they took the papers straight to the Belgian military command for analysis. Rheinberger was a wreck, crushed by the weight of his failure. He was about to become the man responsible for the collapse of the Third Reich. In desperation, he begged a guard for his gun, seeking to end it all right then and there. The guard refused. Rheinberger would have to live with what he'd done. The Belgian commanders pored over the invasion plans, stunned by the level of detail. It almost seemed too perfect. The itch of suspicion began to scrape at their minds. What if this was a German trick, a ploy to divert Allied forces? Maybe the real invasion was coming through the south, through the Maginot Line, and this was just a clever misdirection. However, as the investigation into the Bf-108 Taifun's crash wrapped up, the truth became clear that the crash could not have been simulated. This wasn't a ruse. The plans were genuine. Britain and France had to know, and fast. Panic set in when the German High Command learned the battle plans had been compromised. General Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht's chief of operations, personally informed Hitler of the situation. After reading reports of Hoenmanns and Rheinberger's blunder, he told the Führer, quote, "If the enemy is in possession of all the files, the situation is catastrophic." Hitler had two options: launch the current plan immediately, before Belgium and the Allies had time to prepare, or draft new invasion plans and let the Allies think they knew what was coming. An immediate attack wasn't feasible. The weather wouldn't cooperate until January 17th, and the Allies would be ready by then. But a new plan, a plan they couldn't see coming, could turn disaster into opportunity. On January 13th, Hitler turned to General Erich von Manstein, the former chief of staff of Army Group A, who had been pushing an unorthodox strategy he claimed could bring France to its knees in days. Manstein was a fierce critic of the original plan, Case Yellow. He argued that it was predictable, a rehash of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, and failed to leverage modern advances, especially armored warfare. In its place, Manstein proposed the Schwerpunkt, later known as the Manstein Plan, a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, a heavily wooded region the Allies believed impassable to tanks. But Manstein was a fierce supporter of modern armor in warfare, so he meticulously assessed the Ardennes and concluded it wasn't impenetrable. He envisioned a swift, concentrated thrust through the forest, bypassing the Maginot Line and cutting off Allied forces advancing into Belgium. The German High Command, especially General Franz Halder, had dismissed Manstein's ideas as unrealistic. But now, with the original plans compromised, Hitler himself was invested. The Schwerpunkt plan was now Germany's best shot. While Hitler and Manstein schemed, General Raoul von Overstraeten, the military advisor to Belgium's King Leopold, reacted quickly. He believed the German invasion could erupt as soon as January 14th. Time was running out, and he couldn't afford to wait, not even for the king's approval. That very night, von Overstraeten issued an emergency broadcast. Every one of the 80,000 Belgian soldiers on leave was immediately ordered to return to their units. He tore down the bureaucratic barriers between France and Belgium, barriers that would only have slowed the Allies when they raced to defend Belgium. There was no time for protocol. This was survival. King Leopold urgently reached out to Winston Churchill, demanding Allied guarantees. The message was muddled. The French believed Belgium was ready to invite Allied troops if guarantees were met, and French General Gamelin wasted no time. He brought his troops to the Belgian border, ready to move at a moment's notice. But the British response was tepid, nowhere near what Belgium demanded. Negotiations stalled. Gamelin felt insulted and lashed out, demanding an immediate invitation from the king, even assuring he would withdraw his forces and not respond to future aid requests. Frustration and panic set in. Discord brewed among the Allies when unity was crucial. Once an unprecedented triumph, the captured German plans now seemed like a curse, spreading confusion instead of clarity. The Allies braced for an imminent attack, but hours bled into days, then weeks, and nothing happened. Fear simmered. If the attack had come on January 14th, von Overstraeten might have been hailed as a hero for his speed and foresight. But no attack came. His urgency turned to embarrassment and condemnation for acting without the approval of the king. Time continued to pass by, and von Overstraeten's credibility withered. By the end of January, he was out, forced to resign in disgrace. All the while, Hitler and Manstein played their own game. Manstein's plan was being weighed, and the invasion was delayed. Belgium was left vulnerable. They had to confront Germany directly, admitting they knew the invasion plan. Germany's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, responded with chilling indifference, quote, "That plan is out of date." It was no bluff. The Wehrmacht had moved on, refining their strategy into something far worse, the Schwerpunkt. The pieces were clicking into place. While the Allies were focused on outdated plans, the Germans were setting their trap. Soon, it would snap shut. The attack would still come at Belgium's northeastern border, a feint. It would pull the Allies in, lure them deep into Belgium, away from where it mattered. Once they were committed, the real strike would begin. The main thrust, spearheaded by panzer divisions, would tear through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and drive toward the coast. It was a scythe aimed at the heart of France, ready to sever the Allied armies, cut them off from their supplies, and crush them into surrender. This clever ruse hinged on Gamelin keeping his strategy intact. That was asking a lot, given that his intuition had been flawless until January 14th, 1940. Nevertheless, after the capture of the German plan, everything changed. It did not take a genius to conclude that the Germans might devise a new plan now that the Allies had seen the original version. But for some inexplicable reason, Gamelin failed to adapt his strategy to take into account the new circumstances. In turn, Lord John Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force in France and Belgium, and the British government failed to point this out to him. The Belgian verdict on the captured documents notwithstanding, British generals and politicians, like the British ambassador in Brussels, perhaps still believed they were a German plant. Or maybe they were so embarrassed by Britain's small contribution to the coming ground war that they did not feel entitled to question French strategy. Regardless of the reason, by blindly following French orders and strategy, they failed to recognize that charging into Belgium immediately after the Germans invaded was a disaster waiting to happen. The precious invasion plans that Rheinberger had sobbed over in January were doing exactly what Hitler needed them to do, collecting dust on Allied desks while his trap was sprung. The Manstein Plan, which had sprung from a humiliating crash landing in Belgium and a catastrophic security breach, unfolded on May 10, 1940. The German thrust through the Ardennes shattered every conventional assumption. 7 panzer divisions carved through the forest that Gamelin had dismissed as impassable, while his best troops stood ready in Belgium, guarding against an invasion that existed only in outdated papers. The French command, still wedded to the methodical pace of the Great War, watched helplessly as German forces dashed through 200 kilometers in 5 days. Their communications were slow and ineffective, their tanks lacking radio equipment, while German radio commands crackled across the battlefield at blistering speed. On May 13th, the French line evaporated. The defenders' positions, stripped of heavy forces to fortify Belgium, crumbled under the weight of German armor. Gamelin's headquarters buzzed with activity, pushing markers across maps that no longer reflected reality. The war had outpaced them. The British Expeditionary Force and French elite units found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They had prepared for the invasion described in Rheinberger's documents with meticulous detail, and now the German Panzer Speer was swiftly cutting from Sedan to the English Channel, effectively isolating them from any possible supply line and leaving them in the desperate position of having to mount a miraculous counterattack or be destroyed. By May 20th, some 400,000 Allied troops were trapped against the Channel at Dunkirk, forced to abandon the tools of war in exchange for their lives. When General Weygand arrived to replace Gamelin, he inherited command of a disaster already in motion. That January crash landing in Belgium, which had once threatened to derail German plans, had instead derailed Allied strategy. In the end, Hoenmanns and Rheinberger's blunder had achieved what no amount of German planning could have. It gave them certainty where they needed doubt and confidence where they needed caution. In just 6 weeks, France fell to the German onslaught. The Allies suffered around 360,000 casualties, including 90,000 killed in action, while German losses totaled roughly 160,000. Civilians endured massive suffering, with around 90,000 lives lost during the invasion. The Allies left behind enormous quantities of heavy equipment, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and guns. The French government collapsed, and Marshal Pétain took power, forming a collaborational regime in Vichy, while the Free French movement emerged under Charles de Gaulle. Just like that, one of the world's military superpowers was brought to its knees.